You are listening to Motor Torpedo Boat, Escape from Hong Kong 1941, Episode 2 on War Stories with Mark Felton. This is an audio-only episode. At 3 p.m. on the 25th of December 1941, Major General Christopher Maltby, commanding British forces in Hong Kong, advised the Governor, Sir Mark Young, that further useful military resistance was no longer possible. At 3:15 p.m., Young informed the Japanese that the British would surrender, the final ceremony being conducted at the Peninsula Hotel in Kowloon at 6 p.m. that evening. I received a phone call from the battle box telling me that the back office is doing something and the meeting between departmental heads has been cancelled, wrote Admiral Chan Chak, the Chinese Nationalist Navy liaison officer in Hong Kong. Wait for the governor's phone call at 3 p.m. At this moment, I knew that the future of Hong Kong is over. Fortress Headquarters formally transferred command of the 2nd Motor Torpedo Boat Flotilla to Admiral Chan on the same day, so that the officers and men would not be bound by the terms of the surrender. For the first time, British military personnel found themselves under Chinese command. Chan was widely respected, and everyone involved in the breakout knew that his contacts among the local guerrillas would mean the difference between freedom and capture in the days ahead. At 3:45 p.m., 29-year-old Canadian Ted Ross and his colleague David McDougall, aged 37, who were both employees of the Ministry of Information, moved to King's Theatre from their office where they had orders to locate a large Buick car that had been parked there ready to take Admiral Chan's party to Aberdeen and the motor torpedo boats. At this point, 5 staff officers arrived from Maltby's HQ, including Major Goring, Squadron Leader Oxford, and Superintendent Robinson. The other 2 were Captain Peter Macmillan and Captain Freddie Guest, who was from the Middlesex Regiment. They quickly collected the Chinese party. Everywhere were signs of cast-off badges of office of all kinds, armbands of all descriptions of volunteer work, ARP, special police, ambulance badges, tin hats by the dozen, and plenty of gas masks, recalled Captain Guest. The Admiral was in ordinary Chinese clothes and carried a very small holdall with him. Macmillan and myself both still wore British uniform and carried just a few things that we had been able to lay our hands on in our pockets. They collected a canvas-topped Austin, and then, with the Buick following, the 2 cars sped down a deserted Queen's Road. The British Army sentries at Queen Mary's Hospital were still in position, noted Chan. When informed of the British surrender, Ross and McDougall from the Ministry of Information immediately threw their lot in with Admiral Chan, and McDougall armed himself with a revolver. The main problem facing the Chan party was actually getting safely to the rendezvous with the MTBs hidden near Aberdeen. They were also not the only military personnel who were determined to escape from the Japanese. At Staunton Creek, they encountered the resourceful Commander Hugh Montague, who was overseeing the refloating of Admiralty diesel launch C-410 and the scuttling of the river gunboat HMS Robin. Montague intended to use the C-410 to escape from Hong Kong, and Chan briefed him on the intended destination of the MTBs. Nearby, a party of sailors was trying to get HMS Cornflower's launch going. The Cornflower was a 1,250-ton Arabis-class mine-sweeping corvette commissioned in 1916 that was scuttled in Hong Kong on the 19th of December. Christened Cornflower II, the vessel's cabin launch was big enough to accommodate the 16-man escaping party and take them to the MTBs, but the launch was without fuel and a charged battery. A rating dashed off in the Buick to the nearby naval stores and managed to procure 16 gallons of petrol. The Buick's battery managed to get the Cornflower II's engine started. The boat was quickly filled with food, water, and rifles, and the cars were abandoned. At 4:45 p.m., the Cornflower II got underway, leaving Montague and his party still feverishly working on the C-410. With Sub-Lieutenant Jacob Forster as skipper, Major Goring took overall charge aboard the overcrowded Cornflower II as the vessel weaved among the junks and wrecks that littered Aberdeen harbour. The launch crept down the south channel. Unfortunately, the Cornflower II was spotted by some 4 dozen Japanese infantrymen who had just occupied a pillbox 200 yards away across the water on the mainland side. They immediately opened a brisk fire with their rifles and 2 light machine guns. The launch was riddled from stem to stern. Well, we hadn't got much more than 500 or 600 yards when we were spotted from the shore, and the Japs let fly at us with everything they had, rifles, machine guns, and small shells, recalled Ted Ross. The bullets simply whizzed through the side of the boat as if there would be no side there at all. Several of our chaps were hit, and soon a shot put the engine out of commission. That capped it. There we were, just like sitting ducks on a pond. The machine gun bullets kept tearing in. Lieutenant Forster was struck in the stomach. Second Engineering Officer D. Harley, a merchant service officer from the SS Yaching, went overboard and tried to swim to shore. "A little man behind me drowned noisily," recalled McDougall. "He took a long time to go down, and I could do nothing about it." McDougall himself was wounded shortly afterwards. Mac got one right in his tin hat, another through the sole of his shoe, and just as he was saying how close they were coming, he got one right in the back. The drifting Cornflower II was abandoned in the East Lamma Channel. Some of the survivors swam to a nearby islet called Apley Pai, while some struck out for Aberdeen Island. Commander Sue helped Admiral Chan remove his clothes and false leg that contained 40,000 Hong Kong dollars. The leg and the money were abandoned, and the 2 Chinese officers went over the side of the riddled launch, taking shelter from the Japanese gunfire on the lee side. "What should we do?" shouted Chan above the din to Sue. "Pray, pray to God," replied the Christian Sue. "If we make it out of here, I'll convert to be a Christian," replied the Admiral. Missing an arm and a leg meant that Admiral Chan resorted to a strange lopsided crawl through the water. Initially, Commander Sue, the current Hong Kong freestyle swimming champion, carried Chan on his back until the two became separated. Ted Ross divested himself of his clothes, weapon, and 2,000 Hong Kong dollars before leaving the Cornflower II. "Taking my clothes off made a whale of a difference. I was one of the last off the boat, but the first to reach the island. The water was dancing with bullets. I dived and swam as far as I could underwater, and finally got to the partial shelter of a rock on the shore." The Japanese continued to fire at the survivors as they dragged themselves ashore. McDougall managed to swim to Apley Pai Inlet fully clothed and with his revolver still strapped around his waist. "All the time I could see the familiar sights," recalled McDougall. "The Peak houses, the Aberdeen Road, the famous fish restaurants on the corner where I had eaten many lunches. And all the time the Japanese machine gunners on the hillsides, 600 yards away, went for us hammer and tongs." Apley Pai was soon on fire as the Japanese lobbed phosphorus mortar bombs onto it, setting fire to the scrub vegetation. At sunset, the survivors of the islet crossed the narrow isthmus to Aberdeen Island. 3 boats of the 2nd MTB flotilla were watching the exit from Aberdeen Harbour and awaiting the arrival of the survivors. A skiff containing Lieutenant Commander Yorath of the Naval Staff and Mr. Halliday, a Merchant Navy engineer, arrived shortly before the Cornflower II survivors were located. Yorath passed a verbal order from headquarters for the MTBs to proceed with their escape from Hong Kong immediately. The survivors were swimming and clambering along the rock shoreline towards the MTBs. Admiral Chan had been left behind and hidden among some rocks, while Commander Sue and the others went ahead to fetch some help. Able seaman Downey at the MTBs was ordered to accompany Sue in an open boat to search for and recover the Admiral. They sailed into the teeth of the enemy fire but could not locate Chan. They returned and collected more men, Commander Yorath and Bill Robinson volunteering to go with them. The party eventually located the Admiral by whistling into the darkness. The Admiral was practically at the top of the hill, although it was a difficult climb, related Commander Yorath. "I think he must have gone up there to die. Chinese like having their graves on hillsides. As we rowed back, he sat facing me in the stern and crossed himself, which rather surprised me." Colonel Yi from Chan's staff became separated from his fellow countrymen and ended up ashore on Aberdeen Island with a Danish merchantman called Damsgaard and Lieutenant Forster. This trio hid in a church for a few days until Yi bribed a local to take the two wounded white men over to Hong Kong Island in his junk, where they were taken to hospital. Unfortunately, Forster was too badly injured and succumbed to his wounds. Damsgaard was sent to Stanley's civilian internment camp. Yi managed to avoid capture and made his own way to Chongqing in China and freedom. Of the 16 men who had started out aboard the Cornflower II, 12 made it to the concealed MTBs. There they were issued with dry clothes, steaming mugs of cocoa, and tots of rum by the cheerful crews. The next problem was where to go. The MTBs were badly beaten up after seeing so much action since the Japanese invasion, and their engines were in urgent need of maintenance. In consultation with the MTB's officers, Admiral Chan decided on a relatively short journey north, up the coast to Mears Bay, where Chan had excellent contacts among the local guerrillas. In the meantime, Lieutenant Pittendry had managed to refloat Admiralty launch C-410. Commander Hugh Montague decided to escape with a handful of men, his intention being to rendezvous with Chan's party at Mears Bay and make his way to freedom on foot. At 7 p.m., C-410 left Aberdeen Harbour and proceeded to Lamma Island, passed Northeast Head and set course for Nan Au village in Mears Bay, where Montague hoped to find Admiral Chan and the Chinese guerrillas. With Chan on the bridge of the leading MTB, the small flotilla powered out into East Lamma Channel at 9:40 p.m., the noise of the big engines deafening and more than living up to their Chinese nickname Wind Thunderboats. As the MTBs worked up to 22 knots on the calm water, they encountered a Japanese cruiser that lobbed a handful of shells at them without result. The MTBs slipped past at high speed and arrived at Tong Ping Chau Island in Guangdong Province at 1:30 a.m. on the 26th of December. The boats anchored, and Mike Kendall, along with his 2 SOE agents armed with Thompson submachine guns, and Lieutenant Commander Henry Su, went ashore in 2 skiffs to make contact with the frightened locals who initially thought that the MTBs were Japanese gunboats. After establishing contact with the village headman, they brought him aboard Chan's MTB for a meeting. The MTBs then motored to tiny Nan Au village on the Da Peng Peninsula and dropped anchor for a final time. The searchlight of the Japanese cruiser also speared Commander Montague and the C-410, but inexplicably the Japanese held their fire and the launch was able to escape unscathed. Montague was so exhausted by the day's hectic escape and the enormous stress that he was under that he fell asleep at the helm and ran the launch aground in a bay near Nan Au. All of the vessels were unloaded of their weapons, ammunition, supplies, and loose gear. In January 1942, Kendall's Z-Force retrieved the Lewis guns and ammunition that were hidden in the village. The escapees had managed to escape from Hong Kong, but they were still deep behind Japanese lines, and they faced a long, arduous, and very perilous journey to freedom. Their journey was only possible because of the assistance of Chinese guerrillas who were allied with Admiral Chan's Kuomintang government in Chongqing. The escape party numbered 68 men and 1 dog, Commander Collingwood's Bruce. Mike Kendall took charge. A notorious Chinese smuggler and guerrilla named Leung Wing-Yuan and his band of cutthroats would provide guides to move the British party into Chinese nationalist territory. Sub-Lieutenant Legg, who spoke fluent Cantonese, worked as a go-between alongside Admiral Chan and the Chinese guerrillas. Unfortunately, Chan realized that the MTBs and the Admiralty launch would have to be abandoned, as the escapers would need to move inland on foot, initially to the Chinese stronghold at Weichao, now Huizhou, on the Pearl River Delta. Although Commander Collingwood protested, Chan ordered that the boats be scuttled. Skeleton crews backed the boats out a few hundred yards into deeper water and began the process of sinking them. We had to use axes on the wooden hulls and open the sea cocks to let the water in, recalled a British officer. The the Chinese villagers piled rocks on board. The water was shallow enough that when the MTBs sank, the tops of their bridges and the 12-foot-high communications mast was visible, sticking up above the water. After the British left, a group of guerrillas chopped the mast down. Admiral Chan's group was now deep behind enemy lines. They would have to walk to freedom, and for the largely unfit sailors who suddenly found themselves yomping over jungle-covered hills and mountains loaded down with rifles, machine guns, ammunition and personal kit, it was a daunting prospect that left many extremely footsore and exhausted. For 3 nights, the party trudged through the hills, lying up in concealed positions by day lest they had been spotted by Japanese aircraft or reconnaissance patrols. Leung's guerrillas faithfully guided them. As well as each man carrying a Lee-Enfield rifle or a pistol, in many cases both weapons, the group also hauled along 6 Bren light machine guns and a pair of Tommy guns. Just how effective the group would have been as infantrymen if they had run into serious Japanese opposition is debatable, as aside from Mike Kendall's SOE party and the Chinese guerrillas, the rest were sailors or civil servants. Commander Gandhi divided the men into watches, following shipboard practice. Gandhi was unpopular with the men, many of them considering him to be a martinet, a retired officer who had been called back to service during the battle for Hong Kong. The admiral, still missing his leg, was carried on a chair strapped between 2 long bamboo poles. The wounded civil servant MacDougall was also portaged in this manner, as he could no longer walk. Slow progress was made across broken and steep country, the march being conducted largely in silence. The escape party was divided into 3 groups, each led by an SOE agent armed with a Tommy gun. A gang of Chinese coolies was hired to haul the sailors' kit bags and canned provisions. Several Japanese positions, already identified by Leung's guerrillas, were carefully skirted around, and the escape party was not detected. 3 or 4 in our party were ill, recalled Lieutenant Kennedy, one with dysentery and another suspected of having cholera. It was no wonder when I think back on the food we had been eating. On day 2 of the hike, 27th of December, the 3 groups set off at 8 a.m. During a particularly steep climb up a mountain, 26-year-old Lieutenant Tommy Parson, the former skipper of MTB-27 and Governor Sir Mark Young's naval aide-de-camp, developed heart trouble and collapsed. He also joined Chan and MacDougall in a bamboo pole chair. The going was so bad, and as some of the officers later admitted, the sailors so soft after years of leisurely duties in Hong Kong that the group stopped for a 10-minute rest every hour. Near the town of Danshui, the escapers encountered a group of heavily armed and numerous communist guerrillas who blocked their path. If Chan and the British wanted to pass, the communist leader announced that they would have to pay a fee of 25,000 Chinese nationalist yuan. From his chair, Admiral Chan engaged the communists in a lively negotiation that took many hours to resolve, Chan initially offering only 100 yuan. After the kind of long-winded and loud haggling that the Chinese are famous for, Chan and the communists eventually agreed upon the sum of 1,000 nationalist yuan. Major Goring later remarked that this figure equated in pounds sterling to only £2 6 per British escapee. That day, we marched 31 miles and slept under a tree, recalled Buddy Hyde. It was winter time and the coldest night we have ever slept out in. The 28th of December was more of the same, with the group cross-country trekking through plains and over hills, occasionally passing through isolated villages where the locals would throng and gawk at the strange foreigners as they passed through. But the day also brought the first signs of free China, when the weary column met advanced elements of the nationalist army. The following day saw the escapees arrive at the first proper road they had seen since leaving Hong Kong. Japanese aircraft was spotted overhead on several occasions, but the column was not detected. The local Chinese military commander had bicycles sent down from Weizhou so that the escapees could ride the final 10 miles into the town. However, 40 of the party were so footsore, exhausted or ill that they had to ride pillion. Protecting the town were some impressively huge water-filled anti-tank ditches, and the only way across was along single wooden planks that had been laid over the banks as rickety bridges. The Chinese bicycle drivers did not even hesitate, and with many a British serviceman clinging on for dear life, these plucky locals charged the planks and wobbled across to safety. Many of the British escapers said that crossing the anti-tank ditches was actually among the most frightening parts of their escape. The town was in ruins following a brief but extremely brutal Japanese occupation. It was a major nationalist supplies port since Canton, now Guangzhou, had fallen to the Japanese. The Japanese had withdrawn from the town because they needed every available man for the assault on nearby Hong Kong, but imperial forces had committed several bestial massacres, including attempting to murder every Chinese man of military age that they encountered. Although the Japanese had left, their aircraft had continued to bomb the town regularly, as the Japanese were fully aware of the military importance of the position to the Chinese. Huaizhou, its skyline dominated by a 1,000-year-old stone pagoda, was scarred and battered, many houses having been reduced to smouldering shells by Japanese bombs. Into these ruins had plunged thousands of refugees to swell the town's normal population, and a sizable Chinese army under Lieutenant General Wang Dafu, incongruously dressed in German army helmets and armed with Mauser rifles. After a brief rest, the British column was fallen in, and with the two youngest ratings carrying the white ensign and the Chinese nationalist flag on either side of Admiral Chan and the local mayor, the column marched smartly through the Huaizhou town gates. They were greeted by the deafening cacophony of firecrackers. As the Chinese celebrated the arrival of Chan and the British escapers, the streets thronged with laughing and smiling Chinese of all ages. The British party was housed in a former American missionary hospital in the centre of town, and attended a lavish banquet that was hosted in their honour by General Wang. On the 30th of December, a group photograph was taken with the British party joined by some Chinese army officers. The British sang their national anthem, and afterwards local children presented each man with an orange, some cigarettes, a packet of biscuits, a tin of condensed milk, and a small hand towel. Commander Gandhi issued shore leave from 1 to 5 p.m., enabling the escapers to enter into some intense bargaining with local shopkeepers. In the meantime, MacDougall managed to telephone through a report of their miraculous escape to the British headquarters in Chongqing. Most of the group's small arms and ammunition were handed over to Leung's guerrillas, who would have more need of them, and preparations were begun for the very long journey back to British lines. On the 31st of December, the party marched down to the East River, where they boarded 2 motor houseboats. Car engines that had been converted to run on charcoal gas powered these curious vessels. They broke down regularly. Each boat towed a long Chinese sampan made from a bamboo frame that was covered in rattan matting. Facilities were practically non-existent, and the men were very cold as a freezing wind blew straight through the sampans that were open at each end. The MTB crews enjoyed slightly better facilities aboard the motor houseboats, while everyone else crowded aboard the sampans. Lieutenant Colonel F.G. Chauvin, head of the British military mission China, had laid on the boats and sampans. Admiral Chan was escorted by a party of nationalist soldiers to deter local river pirates and bandits from attacking the craft as they made their way to Longchuan. The 3-man party from Force 136 stayed behind in Huaizhou when the sailors left. They returned to where the MTBs had been scuttled and retrieved the heavy weapons that had been hidden by local villagers. The journey down the river was slow, the boats often impeded by sandbanks. Some of the men walked along the riverbanks during the daylight hours. Food was very limited, just a couple of bowls of boiled rice each day. A 3rd motor houseboat was sent up from Huaizhou to relieve some of the overcrowding. The party then met up with the incongruously dressed Lieutenant Colonel Harry Owen Hughes, the British liaison officer with the Chinese 7th Army. Dressed in a Chinese robe and hat, Owen Hughes had been on the last plane out of Hong Kong, and he was charged with organizing the party's safe transit through southern China. On arrival at Longquan, the MTB crews formed up and marched through the town, which celebrated the arrival of the British with a great show of fireworks, speeches, and feasting. The Hong Kong escapees were now safely inside Chinese nationalist territory, and although their journey back to their own lines would be long and fraught with many hazards and difficulties, they no longer faced being attacked by the Japanese. After battling weather, mountains, and sickness, the party reached Kunming at the start of the Burma Road. There they met not only the British military mission, but also Mission 204, the British and Australian survivors of an attempt to supply and train local ethnic minorities in Burma to fight against the Japanese. Led by Major William Seymour, Mission 204 had only just managed to escape capture around Lashio in Burma, and they had trekked for 6 weeks on foot to reach safety in Kunming in China. The Royal Navy returned triumphant to Hong Kong in 1945, and a new naval base was constructed and named HMS Tamar. Many of the men who had escaped in December 1941 aboard the MTBs also returned to help rebuild the colony. Major Colin McEwen and Monia Talan were both awarded the MBE, a member of the Order of the British Empire, for their exceptional work with Force 136. McEwen later became head of physical education in Hong Kong, while Talan founded travel and laundry businesses. SOE's Mike Kendall ended the war as a lieutenant colonel and was recommended for the George Medal, but his communist connections meant that he did not receive this high honour. David McDougall, the civil servant who had swum for his life under heavy Japanese fire after the Cornflower II had been sunk, returned as Brigadier Colonial Secretary in 1945 and was briefly Governor of Hong Kong in May to July 1947. Admiral Chan Chak became the first post-war mayor of Canton, while his subordinate and swimming champion in December 1941, Lieutenant Commander Henry Xu, finished his service as a Vice Admiral in the Chinese Nationalist Navy and was made an officer of the Order of the British Empire and OBE by the British. He later moved to Taiwan after the communist takeover of mainland China. As Britain slowly relinquished her empire and her global military capabilities, the Navy's presence in the Far East became more and more focused on Hong Kong, until in 1997 the last British warship steamed out of the harbour and the colony was handed back to China. The former home of the Royal Navy in Hong Kong now serves as the main barracks for the People's Liberation Army, garrisoning the Special Administrative Region of China. You have been listening to Motor Torpedo Boat, Escape from Hong Kong 1941, Episode 2, on War Stories with Mark Felton. This episode was written and narrated by Dr. Mark Felton. For a wide variety of military history videos, please visit my other YouTube channel, Mark Felton Productions. You can also help to support both of my channels at PayPal and Patreon, details in the description box below.